Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. This is the second part of the series, Recasting the Business Paradigm by Bloom Ventures and TIE Bangalore. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Just a second, just a second. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, there was an issue. Sorry. Yeah, so I was saying that in this series, we're exploring the challenges and laying out the best practices for HR, legal, and finance functions for startups amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, we'll be exploring the legal angle behind everything HR, from terminations to pay cuts. The session will be moderated by Kamal Karant. Kamal, request you to please introduce yourself and the other speakers and take us through the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Snigdha, and thank you, Try, for hosting us. Welcome, Yashna, as well as Dheeraj to this session. And I'm hoping that, all the things we think we know and what we have been trying to practice by virtue of muscle memory, we sort of reassess that and process through the inputs from Yashna from an HR point of view and Dheeraj from a legal point of view. So that's what we are here for today. Briefly about me, I co-founded Xvino with my co-founder uh, Anil about 3.5 years ago. We call it Xvino, means extend your expression. So we put people to work in terms of leadership team hiring as well as technical and engineering on a just-in-time workforce model. So that's what we've been doing for the last 3.5 years. Prior to that, 2 decades, I've been in recruitment and staffing industry. That's the only thing I know. And last few days since COVID has come through, I've been the most unproductive guy in our organization, according to me. I'm unable to work remotely as much as most of you are, writing dozens of things as to how to go about it. But I can tell you, I'm very busy because many of the people who are calling me are asking me that, look, I got laid off. Somebody is forcing me to take a salary cut. Customers are calling me and saying, we want to invoke force majeure. So in a way, whole lot of legal stuff that I never understood in 20 years, I'm sort of coming into terms with that in the last 2 weeks. So maybe some of the doubts that I'm going to ask Dheeraj are not coming from the world, but coming from my own experience. And, I'm hoping Yashna and Dheeraj will actually shed more light to that. So that's about me and what we're trying to unravel. Some questions have come. We'll try to address that. And Dheeraj and Yashna, if you don't mind, you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much for to Tai for organizing this. This is my second session. Yesterday was our first, which went excellently. So I'm really looking forward to this one. To give you a quick idea of how I came to be here, I am actually a qualified lawyer, but then after practicing for a short while in the UK on labor and union law, I came back to India and joined the HR function. And I've been glad to find myself part of the Bloom family. I work with Passion Connect, which is our incubated services, HR services unit that caters to our portfolio companies. So, Dheeraj, do you want to take over from here?
Yeah, hi. A welcome to all the listeners. So just a small intro. I'm a partner at Constellation Blue, heading the legal practice there. So I think most of our, the clients and the, our specialization is into startup and VC ecosystem. We call ourselves as a boutique advisory firm, trying to, hold off all the pinpoints of the clients, be it in finance, compliance and legal, and call ourselves as one-stop shop for each of those queries or issues that the clients might face. I think just as a quick overview of the session, I think the idea of this session is to just ensure and help the legal and the HR teams to understand the current situation and implications of any action which is being undertaken by these companies with respect to the employment related aspects. Because I'm sure we all have been going through various news and posts being published about major companies taking certain actions, cost corrective actions, which are probably more of them forced upon them rather than voluntarily. But what are the legal implications around all of these actions is something that we'll be discussing over the course of this session. Over to you, Kamal.
Thanks, Dheeraj. Yashna, just in case you're unable to hear me, just signal so that I'm not talking without getting your attention. So let me start by some of the experiences we know that many of you must be going through. Is it legal to ask an employee to take a salary cut? Let's start with that. Dheeraj, if you just want to start by uh, addressing the legal aspect to it, and maybe hand it over to Yashna to cover the HR angle if at all. Is it okay to call somebody into the room and say, I expect you to take a salary cut?
So that's the very direct question, Kamal. Just on so the legal aspects on asking employees to take a salary cut. I think if you ask, there are definitely there is the answer. The easiest answer for us to say is no. There are no such provisions in the law which allow you to deduct salaries just because there are situations which are not favorable for employment in general. In at least let's talk about India. There are various factors that needs to be taken into account upon when the companies are looking at any such deductions. So just to answer on the legality, no, there is no such provision where you can force upon a salary cut, but various nuances of the laws, different laws that are applicable. India being one of the countries where like more than 500 laws are applicable to one company, right? So specifically employment labor related laws itself are quite a number. So all of these laws, employment standing orders, industrial disputes acts, all of these needs to be taken into account when companies are looking for any of these actions. Like I said in my intro, which might be forced upon actions rather than voluntary actions by the companies. But yeah, there are legal implications towards it. So, cut short, the answer would be no. There are no such provisions that you allow an employee to deduct the salaries in general. Over to you, Yash, now on the HR aspect, because I'm sure you guys would be having certain queries from various clients and how to do, especially the HRs of the clients, and how to go about this, because yeah, I mean that's the reality right now.
Yashna, just hold on to before you get on to that. There's a question which is coming, which I guess is good to take at this point of time. But some of the governments actually have cut their salaries, Dheeraj and Yashna. How did they do that? What allows
Uh,
them to cut salaries?
So look, when I said the legal principle is very clear, the employer is under obligation under law to provide that compensation and benefits to the employees. In not only government, I'm sure we have all read news. There are major companies who have gone and deducted salaries. Each case, I mean, needs to be looked upon, right? Only the fact that it comes out in news that the salaries have been deducted, but unfortunately, that's not the exact picture, right? In for a few of those companies, at least what we have seen or we have advised is people have major conglomerates, right? On unicorns, they have taken voluntary reductions. So the founder sending or organizing a town hall, sending those all group emails regarding and being transparent. So I think and probably Yashna can add more. The important aspect is the communication and the way of communication. I'm sure if the founders are pretty transparent about their cash and balance situation and the liquidity situation, there is and the employees are aligned to the larger vision. There are ways and means that the companies can look for deducting that operational overhead cost. Just to be clear on the legal aspect and still try and reduce the operational cost, companies do look for at least deferring or delaying non-statutory benefits that they would have given to the employees, right? Which could be in terms of any other employment health related benefits or probably insurance benefits, which are not statutory driven. So let me be just very specific. Any of those, if the companies are taking a deduction or taking a call in reducing, I think that's perfectly fine, depending on the current situation.
Thanks, Dheeraj. Over to you, Yashna. I know you're
Thank
waiting.
you. So Dheeraj has already given us an idea that we are seeing unprecedented times. So there has been a sense of confusion and a lack of clarity. But I'll tell you how we've gone through things a little bit to give an idea and what we're advising our companies to do as well. focus from day one has been to, of course, keep updated of all news or notifications, especially from the central and state governments. And secondly, and I have to really emphasize on this, so much has information has to be verified. I'm sure we have all seen a lot of confusion extra because people are sending forwards that is unverified information on behalf of governments. So trying to avoid that is a great task to begin with. Then we moved quickly into analyzing how these notifications impact our team, which would lead to putting into place any contingency strategies that are required. And most importantly, which is the bit that binds in with what Dheeraj has been saying, communicating to your employees as clearly as possible what stage you are at. And why I say what stage you are at is we shouldn't be shy to say in certain points that we don't know the answer to this question yet. It's everything is an evolving situation, so it's always easy to be, it's best to be able to say in this situation we don't know the answer to this yet, however we expect to have an answer by so and so time. So when you give a realistic timeline and an idea to your employees that look, we're working on finding out this answer for you as soon as possible, it gives them some kind of sense of comfort saying, okay, I've got someone looking out for me, so that eventually whatever decision that comes, if that decision includes a salary cut, at least your employees feel, you know what, they took the time to consider it and figure out all options before making any hasty decision. So I think that's what HR should be really doing, is following this kind of organization.
Thank you, Ashna, for that. One of the questions which has come, which is appropriate to answer at this point of time is from Balaji, is asking that if we tell the employee a percentage of salary, let's say 20% will be paid later, and it's purely accounted as salary in books, but we want the cash flow to be positive, to be paid later.
Mm-hmm.
How should something like that be done?
So I'll just again emphasis on the legal aspect around it. Just to start off, not a tax expert, but deferment of salaries do have their tax challenges. It would be considered, so I'm sure the concerned person would have taken that into account. So the TDS challenges needs to be first taken into account. Just on deferment, like you said, again, communication is the key there, where the employers are putting that out to the employees with the clear communication on the liquidity challenges and deferring the salaries payouts. The legal position stands same. There is no clear provision under any of these label or regulations which allow you to defer the salaries. But yeah, I mean, like I said, communication needs to be taken into account, and on the tax aspect, TDS provisions and their obligation needs to be taken into account. Yashna, over to you.
So this is something that we have been reaching out to all our various portfolio companies to see how they've been doing the whole adjustments. So far, this is something that is not a very common option, a deferred payment, half now and half later. However, it's not unseen at all. There are people who are doing that to maintain cash flow, as Dheeraj was saying. There is an understanding and a communication, of course, that needs to be made, which obviously would go into explaining what is the reason behind deferring this, and what is the realistic timeline of them actually receiving this deferred payment. And if there is a chance that this deferred payment may not come at all, then it should be communicated clearly from the beginning.
Thanks for that, Yashna and Dheeraj. One question which came last week is a real situation. A startup which has about 62 people, they wanted their employees to go through a salary cut, and they've been transparent about that situation all this while with them about how the organization is doing. And I believe every month they used to show PowerPoints relating to that financial position. And with COVID-19 hitting, so they thought it was important for them to brace themselves for the future. So they agreed that a certain percentage of salaries had to be cut depending on the level of the employees. And they met each employee one-to-one, the founders, and they agreed on a certain cut. In that, over about 15 to 20 people agreed that, okay, I'm willing to take this cut, and signed it right and there that, okay, I'm okay with this cut. And they had a situation where almost 30 to 35 people said, I can't take this cut, and they refuse to take that cut. What should the company do in a situation like that? Can they enforce it on the employees that you have to take the cut if they resist it? That is the question.
So again, while I think one of the answers I can read on the chat is that if the answers are complicated, unfortunately for all the listeners, uh, there is no direct or there is no straight answer on the legal aspects that go ahead and do these actions. All of these are very muddy and answers would be complicated. Unfortunately, every case has to be looked upon on their merit depending on the documents. So we are trying to give you
Dheeraj, I think
You
you've
will have to
gone
repeat.
on mute accidentally.
yeah, sorry, I'm back. Yeah, so that's what I was saying. I unfortunately, just bear with us on without giving any straight answers which may be desired. But considering the provision of law and various statutes that needs to be considered, that's how we can come up with on generic provisions. Just on this specific case, Kamal. So look. Let's take a step back on a few things that have happened, and probably that will help the listeners to understand the provision and the legalities involved. Once our honorable prime minister declared the lockdown, there have been various central and various state advisories that have been issued, saying particularly about not terminating the employees during the lockdown or trying reducing their salaries or cutting their salaries during this lockdown. So, and based on those advisories, various labor commissioners of various states like Karnataka, Mumbai, Maharashtra, and Delhi, at least we know Telangana as well. The orders have been issued not to reduce the salaries or deduct or terminate the workers. Having said that, yes, it's the companies have been taking those forced actions, like I've been saying. So I think looking on the provision under law under Industrial Disputes Act, one of the provisions is of the layoff. So if the nature of the business is as such that the remote work is not possible, which is what has been advised to most of the establishments by the various advisories, but there are few probably line of work where work from home as such is not possible, then the establishment is considered under lockdown, right? It is considered that the employees are temporarily laid off, and the laid off provisions are that the employers would need to pay 50% of their basic of the salary employees basic salary and the dearness allowances. So few of the at least the clients that have taken a recourse that they have considered themselves under lockdown and laid off the employees and are paying that reduced amount of salary. But the point to be noted here is that the nature of work has to be such where work from home is not possible. So some like for people mostly in IT industries or let's say service industries like us, lawyers or professionals, and I'm sure other various areas. I think fortunately for us, we are in this tech world, digital world. So for us, work from home as such as a concept works. So it's not that it is not, but though it has its own challenges and various factors, nuances to be considered. But yeah, it's not that something is unavoidable. In that case, if my employer goes for a lockdown and looks for a layoff, that's might not be the right way, and it will be with the risks that are there under law. So yeah, that's the position on the layoff. In terms of this specific case where the employees refuse to agree to a salary cut, uh, the recourse, I think, like Kamal, like you've been saying, it is the communication and mutual understanding between the parties. Uh, if the company has to go for a under law any changes to their employment terms under the provisions of the law, they have to intimate prior to making certain changes, asking either employees to go for mandatory leaves or reducing their salaries would be considered as a material adverse change to the terms, to the employment terms, which would need or which would trigger a prior intimation to the labor commissioners, which themselves have said and released those advisories that not to deduct the salaries or not to terminate the employees. So it's like a tricky situation for the employers and the founders. But yeah, unfortunately, that's the provision under law, that you have to, if you have to still enforce it, you have to intimate prior, and in some cases take prior permission as well. So in your case, again, our advice would be communication. Sorry for the long answer.
So essentially, you're saying if they disagree, there's nothing you can do about it. You have to pay the full salary.
Uh, yes, again, I don't want to get into the nuances of how an employer can obviously look to trigger a few of the other clauses or have some paper trail. So in few of the cases, at least there were genuine cases where few of their clients were looking to actually lay off certain people or terminate certain people because of non-performance. But the key factor there is that there has to be some documentation which the employer or the founder is able to prove that this termination is not because of the lockdown or the COVID situation. It is because of the general downturn in the economy.
Fair enough. So what I understood from you is that you have to give a notice, 21 days, and you also need to inform the labor department. In a way, it's a kind of a approval net, though the law doesn't say so. You still need to inform the labor department and give the employee notice of 21 days before you effect any change, and it has to be agreed upon. It cannot be slapped upon, right?
Yeah.
From an
Fair.
HR perspective, if I could add a little bit something here.
Go on, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all about HR in this case rather than more on legal.
Sure. So from an HR perspective, it is something that we have seen being done. People are being given salary cuts, and I'm sure there will be a lot of people who, I mean, nobody wants a salary cut, of course. So there, and in some situations, people's hands are tied. So there is a way that this can be communicated to them, and the best way to do that, as I was saying earlier, is to tell them that you have considered all other possibilities. Now, if the possibility is that either we are able to sustain everyone in the team for this much longer, if you guys can understand that we take a little bit less this time, then I think that they are always more amenable to that change. Secondly, also explain to them that the parameters of how to consider how to cut the salary, and how to everyone's salary doesn't get cut at the same level, but it's very much more need based and requirement based. So these considerations, if you make it quite clear to them, then we haven't really heard that much large scale unhappiness. Everyone is very understanding of the situation. And another thing that Dheeraj was saying that struck me at that moment about the law not being super clear in these situations, it's also because there is no precedent, and the law is largely based on precedent. So it's very difficult for them to make decisions knowing that now this will become the next precedent, if a bad situation arises. So it's very difficult for them to make hard and fast rules quickly. So it's sometimes the most unhelpful advice, but having the patience and giving people that time to figure out the answers is something that is what we can do.
Yeah, and just to add another aspect, while mutual agreement with the employers, between the employers and the employees is essential, also another aspect of law that we need to keep in mind is the minimum wages acts. There are more than 80 odd scheduled employment that have been categorized, and there are different slabs for all the minimum wages. I saw a question related to that as well, so hence answering. And most of them are in the, if I have to take a range of minimum wages being around 15 odd thousand a month, and most of them are less than that as per the government notified rules. But yeah, I mean, if companies are looking for any of those salary cuts, they should take a reasonable number or compensation CTC number below that salary cut is not advisable to the companies.
Thank you, Dheeraj and Yashna. So there is this, I'm taking some of the questions which are relevant as they are coming. One of the questions that is asked is, our labor laws have been also set with a lot of industrial mindset, or it was set during those times, and much of this has not changed over a period of time, isn't it? So most startups would come under Shop and Establishment Act, not under Industrial Disputes Act, right? So how would any of these actually apply in this context is the question. Would all these things that you're saying apply to the office staff as well? That's the question.
I think office staff mostly so okay, let me answer. Yes, it applies to the shop, to the establishments as well. Industrial Disputes Act applies to all the establishments. In terms of office employees, I would assume most of the office employees would be either through the contractors or contract staff. In those cases, I think the principal obligation of payment is with the contractor, where you are getting those office employees or workforce in the offices. However, the underlying obligation is also on the employer or the company who is getting those workmen to ensure that these guys are getting paid. And if the contractor is unable to make that payment, then the obligation can fall on to the companies and to those premises who are getting those workforces or workmen. So yeah, I mean, it is important. And in one of the cases we've seen where the contractor triggered the force majeure clause and wanted to really get away from the performance of their payment obligations, which depending on the nature of the services and the nature of the contractors that he's providing can be looked upon. But yeah, I mean, the obligation again is, like I said, the principal obligation is on the contractor, but the back-to-back obligation is on the employer as well. So he has to, or on the premises that these contractors are working on. So those needs to be taken into account as well.
So Yashna and Dheeraj, on that context that you brought up contract employees as well, here's a question. Recently one of the fintech employers, quoted force majeure and terminated the contract with their service provider. So in turn, the service provider terminated hundreds of employees, citing force majeure as well. Is it allowed like that you can terminate an employee quoting force majeure if he or she is a contract employee?
So, Kawal, force majeure as a concept, derives its validity from a contract. So every contract is different. Generally, we have seen force majeure clauses covering acts of war and natural calamity and other stuff. Considering the effect in the size of this epidemic, it can be considered a force majeure clause. But just having a force majeure clause in an agreement does not guarantee you to trigger a force majeure and take recourse against it. It needs to be looked upon very specifically on each of the case, in the merit of the case, whether the performance of the contract actually is something that is getting affected because of this COVID situation or because of this pandemic, right? Like I said, so if one of the if the performance if the contract is for providing workers and they are able to do work from home for whatever reasons and the case may be, then still the client triggering a force majeure might not be relevant or might not be sustainable in the eyes of law. So triggering a force majeure is also important. The fact that needs to be taken into account is whether my performance of the contract is getting impacted because of this pandemic situation. Just not having or just having a force majeure clause does not give you that recourse.
Thank you, Dheeraj, for that. Yashna, in terms of the preference of where contract employees coming and they getting terminated, how do you see the responsibility? Is the responsibility with the team which basically is managing them at a principal employer, or do you think it's better managed through the service provider?
So this is something that we work largely with very early stage startups. So there are a few industries that have third party employees. So usually these are managed by the service providers. In this situation, of course, there would have to be some understanding between the service provider and the founder of the company. What is the kind of situation, if business has been hit, in some situations we have seen, then it really depends on what kind of sector they have been in, and what kind of slowdown they have seen, and therefore if that makes sense. So in the manufacturing sector and in the automobile sector and things like that, where you tend to have larger number of third party employees, and will have in this time also seen that similar kind of slowdown, then I'm sure that they would be communicating that to the service provider, saying, look, we are unable to pay you going forward as things have slashed. I believe reading a report that business slowdown has happened at way over 60% in certain sectors. So it will happen, and we can. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot when I'm saying that it just has to be communicated at the right time.
And also starting with you, Yashna, again, in terms of the behavior of a startup, which is likely to be different than large enterprises when it comes to this situation. What I mean by that is when we move away from, let's say, salary cuts to layoffs, there is a certain way large enterprises have been used to doing it. Now they deliberate in a certain way. There are certain compensation packages that they have planned, and we can argue that they can afford it. But at the same time, there is a certain way that they have gone about it. At least I have seen a few in the last few weeks. And compared to that, is there a behavioral change that you see that the startups are adopting? Because at startups, we know that we all try to work in a certain pace. Everything is fast. When we scale faster. When we hire faster. And also when we are doing layoffs, do you think we also try to do it at a certain pace? And what do you think is the right pace of doing it?
Definitely. So yesterday, this is a subject we touched upon as well, that startups do work quite differently from more established companies. Right now, for startups, I think the biggest thing that they are focusing on, it is a time to chase survival. So how they're doing it is, there's quite an interesting analogy that's going around, where the response that we have seen in the world against fighting coronavirus, where they've had to make difficult choices on whom to prioritize for treatment and testing, is a very similar thing that you're seeing being applied to the startups, where you have to be able to look at it very objectively. Who is coming at a high price point? Who is coming at a lower price point? What is the value add that everyone is bringing? Is it high necessity? Is it low necessity? And will the temporary loss, would we as a business be able to bear that? And will that help in flattening the curve in the long run survival? These are all considerations that that startups are making to be able to come to the right decisions. What I would encourage everyone who is listening and wants to know more about how to go about salary cuts, layoffs, is to tune into the session tomorrow at 3:30, which will be doing a deep dive into this topic in particular.
Fair enough, because there are extreme situations that we are going through. The how is hurting more than the what, as we are observing, right? Like somebody told me yesterday that they got a termination information from their boss via WhatsApp, so of course it's a startup which is bootstrap. He says, the 15-member team, so two of us got a WhatsApp communication. So I think the what is and how that is happening is sort of hurting more, and that is something that I'm sure startups can take cognizance of as to how we are doing this. And like Yashna, you rightly pointed out, with every conversation that we are having with employees, and people are more than happy to understand and voluntarily come forward to take the extreme step, which is painful, but they're offering that is possible, is what we are all observing, right? So some questions I'm taking, in what's coming over here, that when you look at employees in a certain brackets that we are seeing, senior level, mid level, junior level, is there a modus operandi that you would recommend to people? Let's say layoff becomes, inevitable. We have to go by it. Let's say it gives a longer runway as we are all claiming it. Would you treat employees differently? Because, Dheeraj did allude that there is a certain salary levels in which you have to, take cognizance of what the law says, and, ensure that, you take the necessary approvals, or you can't cut at all at a certain salary level if that exists. So how do you differentiate between employees if you are going through, let's say, salary cuts? Is dialogue, we heard that before, or if it's layoff from a legal point of view? Can it be seen as unfair if only a few employees are, let's say, asked to go, Dheeraj?
I think from the legal terminology perspective, layoff and what you're talking about, I think, is a retrenchment, where you're asking to terminate, are slightly handled differently in terms of asking them to or terminate certain section of the employees, be it high management, median, or junior. That is, the retrenchment provisions don't differentiate between in that. If you are classified as a worker or as a workman, which is basically not subject to your CTC that you're drawing, but subject to the function that you are playing in an organization. If you are a managerial, if you're not in a managerial or a supervisory work, then you are a workman, irrespective of whether your CTC is 25 lakhs, 30 lakhs, or whatever that the number may be. In that case, Industrial Disputes Acts and the provisions of the retrenchment under that act apply, where there are severance compensation that has to be paid. The notice has to be prior intimation notice has to be given to the authorities before retrenching, and the procedure laid out in the act needs to be followed. And in some of the situations, in some of the cases, prior consent is also required from the government authorities in case of retrenchment. As far as layoff is concerned, like I said, if the employer is unable to provide workable facility to the employees because of a natural calamity, then it can be considered. It can be considered as a layoff, and in under that also the employers are obligated to pay pay about 50% of their basic salaries and earnings allowance to the employees. So that's the position on law. I saw a few questions on whether the force majeure is considered, or sorry, whether this natural calamity is considered as a force majeure, or this pandemic is considered a force majeure by the government. So the answer to that is yes. The government has notified in various, it's their advisories and circulars that this is triggered as a force majeure event. But like I said, just having a force majeure clause in your contract does not give you that ability to take a recourse in not performing your obligations of a contract. You have to be very specific and analyze whether the performance of the contract is affected by this situation or not.
Dheeraj, there is a question which is may not be direct to what we're trying to solve, but indirectly linked. The question is by, many of them are talking about their direct employees, but actually, deployed to client places, contract employees, right? So if the principal employer has not paid me, and, it's a back-to-back contract I have with my employees, so how do I pay, these guys? If I don't pay them, what does the law do to us? Because my principal employer, as per the contract, has not paid me due to the current situation, and I cannot pay them without that, and it's a back-to-back contract that we have. So what does the law say in terms of, if I don't pay, who's liable, principal employer or me?
So I think when you say that principal employer has not paid, it is basically you're referring to an agreement between a company and a contractor, where the contractor has not paid its employees. So the first and the foremost obligation is on the contractor to pay its employees. If the contractor has failed to do so for whatever reasons, yes, the obligation is on the principal employer, which is the registration that they need to take under the CLRA Act, Contract Labor Registration Act. However, it's not that the contractor can walk away from its obligation. The principal employer will have its recourse against the contractor to claim all the dues that are being paid by the principal employer. So yes, the liability still applies to the principal employer, but the first and foremost obligation is on the contractor to pay its employees, because the employees would have entered into an employment agreement with the contractor and not with the principal employer.
But indirectly, the principal employer is liable. That's what you're saying, right?
In certain cases, yes.
Yeah. So here's a question. I think, just moving away a little from layoffs and salary cuts to the hiring situation. we're also faced with unprecedented context that a lot of people are not accepting offers was something that we are dealing with in the past in the situation that we were in, and we are trying to wonder why people are shopping for offers and things like that. Now there's a unique situation where people have accepted the offer, resigned from the previous employer. Even maybe it's in some of the cases, especially in technology world, the replacement also has been found, but now their new employer is saying, hold on, I can't afford to make you join for different reasons, my situation has changed. Or in some of the cases, yeah, it is situation related, I can't do a e-onboarding also, so that's a more a logistic challenge. But many companies are saying my context has changed, so I cannot hire you. So what is the recourse for an employee who has resigned and his replacement is coming? As you know, when we resign, it's not just a smooth exit everywhere. Some places relationships also break down. So even the previous employer also wants you to go, and you're serving notice, but the new employer doesn't want you. So what's the legal recourse here?
I think once you have put down, or if an employee has put down his resignation and that has been accepted by the company, I think it's there is then, and like you said, the new employer is not able to onboard because of this or any other reason. The concerned employee does not have any recourse against the current company where he's serving notice on, because he has put down his intention to resign, unless obviously, uh, I mean, which is a far-fetched imagination, where you now then try and prove that this resignation was a coerced resignation and not a voluntary resignation. But I mean, that's a long battle, and that's not. I think whenever, even if that might be the case in most of the because of the reality of the situation, the HR of all the companies or the concerned person, the legal team would take into account of those situations and avoid and have that paper trail where the resignation is voluntary resignation rather than a forced resignation. However, just on touching on the obligation of the new employee, well, I think, and that was a question, I think probably that's a question you are referring to as well, Kamal. In terms of new employees, the obligation, in essence, once the contract has been or offer has been made and has been accepted by the employee, uh, the the date of joining becomes the commencement of the relationship between the employer and the employee, right? So in that case, the concerned employee or concerned person needs to look into the documents that has been signed between the two parties and figure out whether the employer can and go ahead and trigger force majeure or take any recourse against any of the defense by not onboarding the new employee. From the employee perspective, like I said, look in the documentation that they have signed with the new employer. From the new employer perspective, if obviously they are first struggling with their overload of the current operational cost and having the new employee costs or new hirings joining in as well, would add on to that burden. In that case, also they need to look into their agreements that they've signed with the new employer, the hires, and figure out if there is any recourse available based on that, on the provisions of the contract.
So you're saying there is a legal exposure for the new employer if he or she doesn't honor the offer letter. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you. There's a question.
But again, that has to be looked into account what documents have been signed, because in most of the cases, generally in startups, first people don't sign agreements. If they sign, they don't sign fully executed stamped agreements, which is not the practice, and which we see in our, whenever we do diligence of startups, the agreements will not be stamped in most of the scenarios. So the validity of the agreement is not in question, but the enforceability of the agreement is always in question. A document which is not adequately stamped. So there are nuances involved around each and every answer. So yeah, I mean, that needs to be looked into depending on the case.
I know.
I have a small thing to add to this from an HR perspective. We have been seeing a few of these situations in our companies as well, and a lot of startup founders, what they are doing is, if there is someone that they have made an offer to and the offer has been accepted and they have completed their notice period in their previous organization, what they have said is, look, right now we are unable to take you on. However, we expect that to change in the future if that is an option. um, and in the meanwhile, as a gesture of goodwill, what I would like to do is get you started working on with us on in the organization. It kind of shows from to the person that there is some faith from the new employer side. They do want us to really be part of it, and they have some trust that you are trying your best to make sure that they do join eventually on the joining date as mentioned in the document. Especially right now during this lockdown period, since a lot of people who went on work from home didn't really have a virtual onboarding system. That's been something that's been delayed to at least the end of the lockdown period. So in a lot of situations where the joining is so clear, the commencement has gone on, unless of course it's in an industry that has seen a very drastic decrease. Otherwise, we've also had a lot of organizations who've delayed the joining date a little bit till they have the infrastructure in place to be able to allow virtual joining and any kind of induction that is required.
Fair enough, Yashna. Thank you for that. In terms of making people, join at a particular date, one observation that I also had is that at least this company that I'm aware of did this unique thing. They asked the new joinees if they can stay back.
Mm-hmm.
What they did? They actually said, "I'll give you 1 month salary for you to stay back. Please, bite the bullet, go back and negotiate with your employer. But I'm willing to give you a 1 month salary as an incentive to do that." Guess what? 9 out of 10, I think it's not that number out of, it was 5 people, 4 of them actually went back and joined, sort of stayed back in their earlier employer. We were glad because at least maybe the relationship was not broken, maybe a bit of a face loss, but they got 1 month salary from the new employer to stay back. That is a great gesture. One of them couldn't because the replacement had already come. So the person had to join the new employer. That was the case. So we've seen different dimensions. I've never heard in many of these things before, but like Yashna says, dialogue is solving most of the things if you're putting your head into it. There was this case where in one of the organizations where they were laying off about close to 40% of their staff. Very clearly, the entire exercise was done by the HR team, whereas the team who were hired, they had different connections with the supervisors and the founders. They insisted that if the founder comes and talks to us, then we will consider whatever you say because we joined this company for the founders. Then the co-founders had to come up, stand, and actually give a detailed note of why they want the situation to prevail and why they cannot hold on to that.
Yeah.
Everybody resigned and walked away. Sometimes I think it's about the how that matters versus the legality, because when you throw a paper at people, all of us are going to resist that. So that's what I wanted to bring to the table.
Correct. What is also important for us to highlight, especially from a point of view of the startups, that there is a lot that can be done. As you were mentioning, that we are seeing so many different reactions to this, because you can come up with so many creative solutions to the problems. This is an opportunity to be able to do that. The main kind of understanding is, of course, what stage of funding you're in, how much money you have, and of course, preserving money going into the near future is a key objective. So if you can analyze all of that and find some solution that works out for you and works out for these people, then that's what we've been seeing a lot of, is great positive responses. The example that you were giving, when they're trying to make good faith gestures, it goes a long way.
So the next question is to you. Yes,
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, on the creative ways, what we've also seen, and while there is a saying, at least in the startup ecosystem, that no equity is cheap, but founders offering ESOP to the employees, and in lieu of any deductions or any salary cuts that they are planning to implement, which is what many of the founders, at least that we've spoken to, have implemented in their organization. So we are probably in at least in the funded companies, they would already in most of the cases would already have an ESOP pool that they can play with if the founders can figure out based on whatever is the requirement to allocate certain portion of that ESOP pool to these employees or to their employees in lieu of any deductions. I'm sure that can be looked upon again, but that everything has to be with the basis is the communication there.
Fair enough. One question which has come for the third time, so I guess can't ignore it anymore, though I thought maybe uh, is kind of outside the purview of the topic we chose, but still, Dheeraj, if we can. So there are customers who are delaying the payments, who are supposed to pay the payments, which are basically for the contractors or employees in a way. Is there something that one can do to pressurize, or let's say, is there a legal way to get the principal employees to pay up? Because they have force majeure as well. They're not terminating the contract, but they're delaying the payment. As you know, many of these contracts are back to back. So only when they pay the service provider, then only they can pay the contractors, right? So I saw that question for the third time coming. So I'm asking you, Dheeraj, that is there a way we can pressurize the enterprise or the startup which is not paid? Because a lot of fintechs that employ contract staff that we have seen in the startup space. So do you have a suggestion for that?
Look, unfortunately, if there is a force majeure triggered by a contractor, and let me put that if it's a justified force majeure because of the nature of the workforce, then that similar force majeure or a provision will apply, or the principal employer can also take a recourse on. It cannot be.
Dheeraj, I have to stop you there. That's not the question. The question is, they're just delaying the payment. They're not terminated by force majeure or anything.
That's what I'm saying. So mostly the remedies and the force majeure is mostly the temporarily delaying of the performance of the contract. In this case, performance of the contract is making the salaries or making the payments to their employees, right? Now, in this case, if the contractor has triggered a force majeure, which can be justified, I'm assuming with all the facets or nuances of a force majeure that can be looked upon. It cannot be a case where then the most likeliest of the cases is that the principal employer will have the same provision applicable as well. I would be surprised if there would be if because of this force majeure the contractor is getting away with its obligation to pay and the principal employer is now obliged to pay because of it. If the force majeure is applicable to the contractor, it's similarly it's applicable to the principal employer. I'll just touch upon another question that came in about though I think we are so just for our listeners, we're covering another session on 14th of April, talking in great detail upon force majeure and its implications on the transaction fundraising. One of the questions was what is frustration of a contract, and that's the term that is being used often these days. So frustration of a contract is where the basic premises of a contract you are unable to perform. And it's the recourse under Section 56 of the Indian Contract Act is taken when the force majeure clause is not present in an agreement. So what happens if a force majeure clause is not present in an agreement? The parties go for frustration of a contract, which primarily means that the parties are looking to terminate the contract. In frustration of a contract, you cannot temporarily suspend the performance of the obligation. You can only terminate or look as a remedy. You can look for termination. So yeah, just to give a brief to listeners.
So to this question, you're essentially saying that enterprise or a startup can invoke a force majeure and delay the payment, though it is due to the contractors, right?
Yeah, depending on like I said, each case needs to be looked upon whether the performance of a contract, like I've been just for the at the cost of repetition, if the performance of the contract merits force majeure, then the force majeure can be implemented. But if the performance of the contract is such which does not affect by this situation, then even having a force majeure clause will not suffice and give remedy to the party. So it needs to be analyzed based on a contract on agreement basis.
Sure. So there is this question, Yashna, has an HR angle and also a legal angle, like all these questions, which is asking that, look, a lot of startups we know that at least in the fintech space, they have field staff who go and do the last mile, connection to ensure that the documentation is complete or whatever that has to happen. They still have, in spite of the technology interface, to secure a customer, to complete the customer transaction, there is a touch involved. So many of them have large number of field staff. So in the current circumstances, the field staff cannot work and they cannot go out there. But at the same time, they had to be paid, right? So because they cannot go out and work, can employers refuse to pay them?
So I'll just cover from the legal and then the Yashna can pitch in. I think Kamal, there have been various advisories and circulars given by the central government and various state governments where they've made it clear that during the lockdown, if the employees or the workers are not available for work, they should be considered on duty and to be paid full wages or full salaries.
Yashna, you're trying to say something?
No, I was just about to add over to what Dheeraj was going to say. In this situation, it's a little bit different in terms of if the contracts haven't been signed, there are lots of situations where an email sign off or a virtual signature can be used. We have seen that in a lot of enforcements of contract. The legality of that, of course, Dheeraj will be able to tell us. But I have been spoken to a couple of people who have needed certain signatures during this period and have found ways around it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Uh, the wide view that is coming, overall is that, dialogue, the context change. Legally, not everything is straightforward, so we understand the disclaimers coming from it. One thing that I also wanted to highlight is, though Dheeraj is a qualified legal expert, we are thinking, and our claim to all of you is that I want you to take this as an input. We're not giving it as a legal advice, so you can go and quote Dheeraj, this is what he has said and this is what applies, right? So we're just sharing in the context of our experiences what is that we are seeing that's happening. So the disclaimer is not to construe this as a legal advice, right, Dheeraj? Is that the right way to say it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm sure Ty has given their all the disclaimers to the participants before organizing these sessions. But yeah, I mean, none of them are a legal advice. So if there is any case-specific queries, we're happy to address. You can reach out to our respective email IDs. We'll have someone at the Ty to share those.
My last question is to both of you. Many organizations choose this time to fire non-performers. Okay, we all know one way or the other. In our excitement, we hire people, and this is the time when I've been told that we look at saying, okay, we decide that some of these guys are not the right guys to have on, and maybe COVID-19 is not the right time to possibly pick on non-performers. But I guess that's how it happens, right? So, Yashna, from HR point of view, picking on non-performers at this point of time, would you advise that?
No, I don't think anyone would. To be, really look at it from a humane perspective. In any situation, if you are, letting go of someone who is a non-performer, the assumption that we are working with is that it will perhaps motivate them into looking at another opportunity and doing better at it. But right now, given the circumstances, I'm sure everybody understands that there aren't so many other opportunities out there. Hiring is so you're basically letting go of someone who has very little chances of finding something else. So if that is an avoidable situation, it goes back to that whole question of when we were talking about layoffs. What is the necessity or the value add that the person is having? If that person is their performance, or in this case non-performance, not impacting during this situation, then of course would be the humane advice would be to try to avoid letting go of that person until that person is equipped to deal with the situation better.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add on there that considering the limitations that the employees will have in terms of working from home, which is as simple as unavailability of any adequate IT resources or connectivity issues, that needs to be taken into account when the founders or the employers are looking to trigger non-performance during these lockdown issues. As far as tackling non-performance and the termination. Like I said earlier, if there is that much of documentation that companies have, that they were in discussion. Let's say a company was already in discussion for terminating certain employees, probably in January or any other date prior to the lockdown. I think it's fair ground for the employers to go ahead and terminate the employment, but obviously looking and taking care of all the legal procedures and regulations that are involved in terms of terminating the employees, giving them opportunity of being heard, following principles of natural justice, paying due consideration, that needs to be taken into account. But just as a general principle, overarching principle, we have advised clients not to terminate employees at least during the lockdown, or
I would
till the
say
lockdown continues.
there's one more thing I quickly thought of whilst you were saying that. That is that termination of a non-performer isn't the first step to of non-performance. Letting somebody go is a very drastic and a last measure step. There's a lot of steps that you can try to do in that situation to get that non-performer to a acceptable performing level. If that person has already been notified before, has been put on a performance improvement plan, there has been full efforts to bring that person's performance around, and it hasn't happened, then it can be an understanding, but you don't want it to be an opportunistic moment either. Whereas if this is actually a great time to be that kind of an HR leader, where you go up to that person and say, you know what, you were not performing really well, you have a great opportunity here to make use of a lot of extra time which we are having in this lockdown period, to pull your socks up, and your focus isn't taken away. So give them that opportunity and let them understand the severity of that issue, because they'll know at the other end of that will be perhaps something worse.
Thank you, Yashna, for that, and Dheeraj. Uh, well, over time, so I thought it's important to sort of highlight what's the most important thing. There are laws, and definitely you can look at the law and say this is how it has to be executed. And there are a lot of hurdles to execute that, so you need experts, and not everyone can do that fluently. As I saw some of the layoffs happening or the salary cuts happening, it's important that the right people in the organization do it, who have experience and who have the finesse to do it, because you're dealing with people. Very clearly, as Yashna highlighted frequently, that you need to have a dialogue with employees to get this over. You cannot get into the Josh and say, don't you know we are bleeding? Don't you know that we haven't got enough cash flows? And the wise man tell us that you need 30 months cash flow, so we are doing everything to survive. I saw some US talk shows which said that, we let you go now, but because we are letting you go now for the reason that when you come back, there should be a company. Nobody likes to, sort of, when you're individually affected, I don't think any of these things work. So you need to take people into confidence. And the only thing I want to leave all of you with is the how matters. Everybody gets the why. They get to know that the company is not doing well, the cash flows are bad. Most of the startups are very transparent, so people get it. But how we do it matters, and sort of reduces the acidity and headache for legal experts and HR folks in the company. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and Dheeraj and Yashna for your valuable inputs. I hope many of these are useful, and Srita for coordinating, and Ty for this opportunity. Thank you, and bye bye.
Thank you very much
Thanks,
for
thanks,
this
thanks.
opportunity. I would encourage everyone who is keen to know more about it to join the other TIE sessions, as well as follow us, TIE and Passion Connect, on social media. We're trying to provide regular updates of the situation so that everyone feels supported through this time.
Yeah, I'll just take one last question. I mean, I thought it's an interesting question before we all wind up. I think the question was if the termination can happen via board resolution. Or yeah, so the question was if the board resolution says so, can the company terminate without giving notice period to the employees? So the answer to that is most likely no. Under the provisions, under the laws, you have to have provide notice period to the employees, or buy out the notice period by paying them in lieu of that notice period. So you cannot terminate just by passing a board resolution between your stakeholders and terminating employees without paying them, in lieu of their notice period. And like you said, try and avoid the termination during the lockdown or till the time lockdown continues, because that's the advisories. And we have seen few actions against the companies specifically by the police office, by the police authorities. Against these, there have been very few, 1 or 2 cases, but there are cases where actions have also been taken. So yeah, just want to leave on that note that yeah, while we all understand and appreciate the cash liquidity crunch that the employers face, like Kamal mentioned, communication is the key. Where if you are being transparent, everyone understands the why. It's the how that matters. So yeah.
Thank you, Yashna, Dheeraj, and everyone.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you so much, Kamal, Yashna, and Dheeraj.
Yeah.
We've covered a range of questions today, and thank you so much for taking us through these, sharing your insights and your views on questions which might not even have clear answers. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sanam, for coordinating this from Bloom's side. And for all of you who are with us today, we have tomorrow a session on layoffs and acqui-hiring. So this will be at 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. tomorrow instead of the usual 3:30 to 4:30. We will be sending you a calendar invite, but the link remains the same. Sorry. So thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.